There is a question sitting at the center of neuroscience that the field has been working around for decades without actually answering it, not avoiding it exactly, working around it, publishing thousands of papers adjacent to it, building careers near it, developing increasingly sophisticated tools that get closer and closer to the edge of it without ever crossing over. The question is not obscure. Every serious researcher in the field knows exactly where it is, and the fact that it remains unanswered after decades of serious effort is not a minor gap in an otherwise complete picture. It is the picture. Everything else is the frame. Here is the question. You are conscious right now. You are having an experience. There is something it feels like to be you, sitting where you are, reading these words, with a specific quality to the light and a particular weight to the air and an inner sense of your own presence that has been running continuously, as far as you can tell, for your entire life. That experience is the most immediate and certain thing you have access to. It is more directly known to you than any fact about the external world, and science has no explanation for where it comes from. Not an incomplete explanation, not a partial one, no explanation. This is worth sitting with, because the default assumption is that neuroscience has mostly figured this out and is filling in the details. That assumption is wrong. Researchers can tell you which regions of the brain activate when you see a color. They can trace the signal from your retina through the visual cortex, identify the specific firing patterns that correspond to different wavelengths of light, map the neural architecture involved with extraordinary precision. None of that tells you why any of it produces an experience at all. Why there is something it feels like to see red rather than just a mechanical process happening in the dark, generating outputs with no inner quality to them whatsoever. The mechanism is mapped, the experience is not in the map. Here is the thing about that gap that most coverage of neuroscience does not say directly. It is not getting smaller. The more carefully researchers look, the more precisely they can describe what the brain does, the sharper the gap becomes between what the description covers and what it leaves out. More data, better instruments, higher resolution scans, all of it increases the precision of the map without moving the experience any closer to being inside it. That is not the normal trajectory of a scientific problem being solved. That is a different kind of problem entirely. The formal name for it is the hard problem of consciousness. A philosopher named David Chalmers gave it that name in 1994, and the name has stuck because it is accurate. Not hard the way curing cancer is hard, where you understand the type of problem you are dealing with and need to accumulate more knowledge and better tools. Hard in the sense that the standard tools of scientific explanation may not be the right type of tool for this problem at all. The physical description of a brain process is always, in principle, complete without mentioning experience. You can give a full account of every neuron, every synapse, every chemical signal involved in perceiving something and never once have to say anything about what it feels like, which means the experience is always something extra, always left over, always sitting outside the explanation no matter how detailed the explanation gets. That is not mysticism, that is the formal structure of the problem as it appears in peer-reviewed philosophy and published neuroscience. Serious researchers, not spiritualists or pseudoscientists, have been pointing at this specific structural issue for 30 years. What they have not done, at least not openly, is follow the implication of that structure to its conclusion, because the implication is uncomfortable. If physical explanation is always in principle complete without including experience, and yet experience clearly exists, then either something is missing from our picture of physics, or something is missing from our picture of how explanation works. Either way, the foundation shifts. Neuroscience has mapped almost every functional region of the brain. It has identified which circuits activate during attention, during memory formation, during fear, during sleep, during every measurable state of awareness. That body of work is genuinely remarkable. It has also not touched the central question: why does any of that activation feel like anything to the person it is happening inside? That question sits exactly where it sat 30 years ago. And the closer you look at that gap, the more it looks like something is structurally wrong with how we have been thinking about this from the beginning. In 1994, a philosopher named David Chalmers stood up at a consciousness conference in Tucson and drew a line that the field has not crossed since. What he did was simple. He split the problem in two. On one side, he placed what he called the easy problems. Why does the brain discriminate between different stimuli? Why does it integrate information from multiple sources into a single coherent signal? Why can it report its own internal states, direct attention, control behavior? These are called easy, not because solving them is trivial. Chalmers himself noted they are roughly as easy as curing cancer or reaching another planet. They are called easy because they are at least the right kind of problem. They ask how a physical system produces a function, and science knows how to answer that kind of question. You find the mechanism, you map the circuit, you trace the signal. The method works. The easy problems are hard, but they are scientifically tractable. Then Chalmers named the other side, the hard problem. And the hard problem is a different kind of question entirely. Why is any physical process accompanied by experience at all? Not how does the brain process visual information? Not which neurons fire when you see something. Why is there something it feels like to see anything in the first place? Why does the physical activity in your brain produce a subjective inner world rather than just running silently in the dark, processing inputs and generating outputs with nobody home to notice? That is the hard problem, and 30 years later, it has not been solved. Not partially, not approximately, not at all. Here is the example worth sitting with. You look at something red. A red wall, a red coat, does not matter. What happens in your brain is now extraordinarily well documented. Light at roughly 700 nanometers hits your retina. Photoreceptors fire. Signals travel through the optic nerve into the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. From there, they route into the primary visual cortex, then into higher visual areas that process color, shape, context. Specific neurons respond selectively to red wavelengths. The whole pathway can be traced, measured, modeled. Neuroscience has done this. The data is solid, and none of it explains why you experience redness, not why you process it, not why you respond to it, why there is something it is like to see it, why the interior of your experience has a quality, a particular redness, rather than just a label, a category, a firing pattern that influences the next firing pattern with no felt quality attached. That quality, what philosophers call a quale, is the thing no physical description touches. And here is what makes this genuinely strange. The physical description is not incomplete. It is not missing a step or waiting on better instruments. Every piece of the mechanism is there. The explanation is fully intact as a physical explanation, and the experience is still sitting on the other side of it, unexplained. This is what Chalmers meant when he said the hard problem is hard. It is not hard the way a difficult equation is hard. It is hard because the tools science uses to answer questions about mechanisms do not reach the question being asked. You can describe a fire completely in terms of oxidation, temperature, energy release. That description is not missing anything as a physical description. But if you wanted to know what heat feels like to a hand that touches it, the oxidation equation does not get you there. The gap between the physical account and the felt experience is structural. It is not closed by adding more detail to the physical account. Now, the standard response from physicalists, scientists, and philosophers who hold that everything is ultimately physical is that this gap is temporary, that once we understand the brain well enough, the explanation will follow. That consciousness is an emergent property, something that arises from sufficient complexity and integration, and that we simply haven't traced the emergence fully yet. My position is that this answer quietly sidesteps the actual problem. Emergence explains how properties arise that weren't obvious from lower levels. Wetness from water molecules, temperature from molecular motion. But those emergent properties are still physical properties. They are measurable. They exist in the same descriptive space as the things they emerge from. What the hard problem points at is something that does not emerge into the physical description no matter how far you push it. The experience of redness is not a more complex version of a wavelength measurement. It is a categorically different kind of thing. Steven Pinker put it plainly. The easy problems are about as easy as going to Mars. But the hard problem is not just another item on the same list. It is a different list entirely. One list asks how physical systems do things. The other asks why doing things feels like anything at all. Chalmers drew that line in Tucson in 1994. What is remarkable is not that nobody has crossed it. It is that the harder the field works at the easy problems, the sharper that line becomes. Every mechanism identified, every circuit mapped, every neural correlate pinned down with greater precision, and the gap between the physical story and the experience of being inside it stays exactly where it was. Fixed. structural, unmoved by data. The physical story is complete and experience is just sitting there, unaccounted for, on the other side of it. The technology has never been better. Functional MRI can track blood flow changes across the entire brain in real time. EEG captures electrical activity at millisecond resolution. PET scanning maps metabolic processes region by region. We have tools that would have seemed like science fiction to researchers 50 years ago, and we have spent decades using all of them on the problem of consciousness. The results are genuinely impressive, and they have not answered the question. Here is what the field has actually built. Neuroscientists can now tell you, with considerable precision, which brain regions activate when you perceive a face versus a place. They can identify the circuits that engage when attention shifts. They can map the patterns that correspond to waking states versus sleep states, to conscious access versus unconscious processing. The neural correlates of consciousness, the specific configurations of brain activity that show up alongside specific experiences, have been catalogued in extraordinary detail. Thousands of papers, decades of data, a picture of the conscious brain that is richer and more precise than anything that existed before. That is real progress. The problem is that none of it is the right kind of progress. A correlation is not an explanation. Knowing which regions light up when you see red tells you where the brain is active during the experience of seeing red. It does not tell you why that activity produces an experience at all. The lighting up and the seeing are two separate things, and the gap between them is exactly the gap that 30 years of scanning has failed to close. Every time a new imaging result comes in, researchers describe it as a neural correlate of consciousness, which is honest language. A correlate is something that tracks alongside something else. It is not something that produces it. The field has become fluent in describing the tracking. The producing is still unaccounted for. Now here is where it gets more uncomfortable. In 2025, researchers using direct intracranial recordings in human patients identified the thalamus as a critical gating mechanism for conscious perception. Specific higher-order regions of the thalamus, it turned out, showed earlier and stronger consciousness-related activity than the prefrontal cortex. The thalamic regions were driving the prefrontal cortex during the onset of conscious perception, not the other way around. This matters. For decades, the dominant assumption was that consciousness is primarily a cortical phenomenon, something that happens in the large, complex outer layers of the brain that humans have in extraordinary abundance. The thalamus was understood as a relay station, a switching hub, important infrastructure, but not the seat of awareness itself. The 2025 finding reframes that picture completely. The thalamus is not a relay station. It is a gateway. And here is what should give you pause. The thalamus is roughly 400 million years old. Fish have one. Reptiles have one. The structure sitting at the center of human conscious experience is older than the dinosaurs. It has been conserved across hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate evolution, largely intact in animals with no cortex to speak of. What does that tell you about where consciousness actually lives? Does a fish have conscious experience? We have no idea. We assumed the answer was probably no, because fish lack the cortical architecture we associated with consciousness. Now we are finding that the gating mechanism for consciousness in humans runs through a structure fish have had the whole time. The question we thought was settled turns out not to have been a settled question at all. And then there is the timing problem. This one is harder to dismiss. EEG studies have found that the neural correlates of consciousness for a given stimulus appear in the brain's electrical activity before the stimulus is presented, not after. Before. The brain is showing signs of conscious processing for an event that has not happened yet by the clock on the experiment. This is not a fringe finding from a single lab. It has been replicated. The standard interpretation is that the brain is doing predictive processing, building a model of what is about to happen based on prior context. That is a reasonable explanation. It is also not a complete one. If the neural signature of a conscious experience appears before the experience, what exactly is the correlate correlating with? The framework of stimulus followed by neural response followed by conscious experience, the basic sequence that almost every theory of consciousness assumes, does not survive this data without significant revision. What every new finding has in common is this. Each one is presented as progress, because technically it is. We know more about the thalamus now than we did before 2025. We know more about the timing of conscious access than we did before those EEG studies, but each finding also reveals a new layer of complexity that the previous picture could not account for. The mystery does not shrink, it relocates. The question that seemed to be about the cortex is now partly about the thalamus. The question that seemed to be about stimulus and response is now partly about temporal sequences that run in the wrong direction. Every answer produces a harder question than the one it replaced. My position on this is simple. The accumulation of neural correlate data is not the same thing as progress on the hard problem. It is progress on a different problem, the problem of mapping which physical processes accompany which mental states. That is useful. It is useful for medicine, useful for understanding attention and perception, useful for diagnosing disorders of consciousness. But it runs alongside the hard problem without touching it. 30 years of scanning have produced an extraordinarily detailed description of the brain's activity during conscious experience. That description is complete, and experience is still sitting there, unaccounted for, exactly where Chalmers left it in 1994. That is worth sitting with. The field has not been idle. It has not been careless. It has generated more data about the brain than any previous era in history. And the central question, why any of this physical activity produces anything it is like to undergo, has not moved. We have the most detailed map of the brain ever assembled, and it does not tell us what we actually want to know. Every day, in hospitals all over the world, doctors remove consciousness from a human being and then bring it back. They do this with precision. They do it on a schedule. They adjust the dose, monitor the depth, and reverse the process on command. The patient goes under, the surgery happens, the patient wakes up. This is routine. It happens millions of times every year across every country with a functioning medical system. And if you ask an anesthesiologist exactly how it works, not the procedure, not the dosing protocol, but the mechanism by which consciousness itself is removed, the honest answer has not changed in nearly 2 centuries of clinical use. We do not fully know. That is worth stopping on. General anesthesia was first used in clinical surgery in the 1840s. That is not recent science. That is older than germ theory, older than the discovery of DNA, older than the understanding that neurons exist. And in all the time since, with every advance in molecular biology, brain imaging, and pharmacology, the fundamental question of how anesthesia removes experience has remained open in the published literature, not almost answered, not answered with minor gaps, open. Here is what we do know. Drugs like propofol and isoflurane suppress neural activity in the thalamus by enhancing the action of a neurotransmitter called GABA, which inhibits neuronal firing. The thalamus is a relay structure sitting at the center of the brain. It gates incoming sensory signals, deciding what reaches the cortex and what does not. When anesthetic agents suppress thalamic activity, the cortico-thalamo-cortical loop, the communication circuit linking the thalamus and the cortex back and forth, breaks down. Sensory information stops reaching cortical processing regions. The brain, in a measurable sense, goes quiet in the places where it is usually loudest during waking experience. That is the cellular account. It is accurate, it is well documented, and it explains almost nothing about the thing we actually care about. Why does disrupting that circuit remove experience, not the processing, not the behavioral response, not the ability to report a stimulus, the experience? The fact that there was something it was like to be awake, and then there is nothing, and then there is something again. The cellular mechanism describes what the machinery does. It says nothing about why the machinery was producing anything in the first place. Think about what that gap actually means. You can trace exactly which receptors propofol binds to. You can watch thalamic firing rates drop on a recording in real time. You can see the EEG flatten as the patient loses consciousness. All of that is visible, measurable, reproducible. And the thing that disappeared, the experience, left no trace in any of those measurements that explains why it was there in the first place or where it went. It just stops. Then it comes back. Now add the 2025 findings. Recent research identified something that changes the picture further. Consciousness, it turns out, is not just passively switched off by anesthetic agents and then passively switched back on when they clear. The brain actively reboots it. There is a process of recovery that involves specific neural dynamics, a structured sequence of reactivation rather than a simple return to baseline as the drug dissipates. The brain, in some sense, works to restore conscious experience rather than simply defaulting to it when the interference is removed. That is a significant finding, because if consciousness were a simple emergent property, just what happens when neurons fire in complex patterns above a certain threshold, you would expect recovery to be passive. Remove the drug, firing resumes, emergence happens automatically. But that is not what the data shows. The data shows something that looks more like a system actively reconstructing a state it recognizes as its own. That implies a level of organization in consciousness that goes well beyond what a purely passive emergence model would predict. What does that mean? My position is that it means the question is harder than the standard account admits. A system that actively recovers its own conscious state is not behaving like a simple byproduct of neural complexity. It is behaving like something that has more structure, more integrity, more coherent organization than we have language to describe cleanly within the current framework. And science has mostly noted this and continued scheduling procedures. The anesthesia case is not a philosophical thought experiment. It is not a brain in a vat scenario. It is a clinical reality performed under fluorescent lights in tiled rooms every morning in every major city on the planet. Consciousness is reliably removed. Consciousness is reliably restored. The mechanism at the cellular level is understood well enough to do this safely at scale, and the deeper question, what consciousness is, why disrupting a relay circuit causes it to vanish, why the brain treats its recovery as something to be actively accomplished rather than passively received, sits in the literature noted, discussed, unresolved. That is not a minor gap. That is the center of the problem. If we cannot explain how a drug removes experience after nearly 2 centuries of trying, we are not close to understanding what experience is. The routine nature of the procedure can make it feel solved. It is not solved. We perform this procedure on millions of people every year, and the honest answer to how it works is that we do not fully know. Imagine a version of you that is physically identical in every way, every atom in the same position, every neuron firing in the same pattern, every word coming out of its mouth the same word you would say, same brain, same body, same reported experiences. If you say you are feeling pain, it says it is feeling pain. If you reach for a glass of water, it reaches for a glass of water. Every behavioral output is identical. Every neural firing pattern is identical. Every functional response to every stimulus matches yours exactly, and yet there is nothing it is like to be it. No inner experience, no sensation of red when it looks at red, no feeling of cold when it touches ice, just processing, output, response, with no one home to experience any of it. This is what philosophers call a philosophical zombie. And the argument built around it is not a thought experiment in the science fiction sense. It is a formal logical argument about what materialism can and cannot explain. Here is what makes it serious. Chalmers is not asking whether zombies actually exist. He is asking whether they are conceivable without logical contradiction. Because if they are, if you can coherently imagine a physical duplicate of a human being that lacks consciousness entirely, then consciousness cannot be a purely physical property. The logic is tight. If consciousness were simply what the physical processes do, then any system that duplicates those physical processes would automatically duplicate the consciousness. You cannot have the full physical duplicate without the experience tagging along, any more than you can have water without the wetness. But we can conceive of the duplicate without the experience. We just did. Nothing in that description generated a contradiction. And that conceivability, Chalmers argues, is doing serious philosophical work. It means there is a gap between the physical facts and the conscious facts that cannot be closed just by adding more physical facts. Think about what that means. Science describes the brain in physical terms: neurons, electrochemical signals, information flow across cortical regions. Every piece of that description is available to us, mapped, documented, measured. The zombie has all of it. And it still lacks the one thing that seems most obvious and most immediate to every person who has ever been awake: the fact that there is something it is like to be them. That absence in the zombie is not a missing physical component. Nothing physical was left out. The absence is the experience itself, which means experience is not in the physical description, not as a consequence, not as an emergent property, not as something that automatically follows. It is simply not there. Now, the materialist response is not silence. The response is that philosophical zombies are not actually conceivable. That when you really understand what it means to duplicate every atom, every neuron, every firing pattern precisely, the idea of a physically identical system that lacks experience becomes incoherent. That consciousness just is what certain physical processes do, and imagining those processes occurring without consciousness is like imagining water molecules arranged exactly as they are, but the water not being wet. The zombie on this view is a failure of imagination dressed up as a logical argument. This is worth sitting with, because the materialist response does not actually show that zombies are inconceivable. What it shows is that if materialism is true, then zombies are inconceivable. But that is exactly what is in question. The argument goes in a circle. The materialist is saying, because consciousness is physical, you cannot separate them even in imagination. And Chalmers is saying, because we can separate them even in imagination, consciousness is not purely physical. The response restates the materialist assumption rather than defending it. It does not close the gap, it relocates it. Here is the dark part of this. When materialists say zombies are inconceivable, they are staking a very strong claim that we do not actually understand what we are imagining when we describe inner experience as separate from physical function. That the feeling of understanding what experience is, the immediate and obvious certainty that there is something it is like to be you right now, is itself a kind of confusion. That once you really understood the physics, you would see there is nothing left over. My position on that is straightforward. An argument that asks you to disbelieve the most direct and immediate fact you have access to, the fact of your own experience. In order to preserve a theoretical commitment to materialism is not resolving a problem. It is asking you to deny the thing that motivated the problem in the first place. What the zombie argument actually does is make visible what was always true about physical explanation. Physical descriptions describe structure, they describe function, they describe causal relationships between states. What they do not describe, by design, is what it is like to occupy any of those states. A complete neuroscience of color perception tells you every physical fact about seeing red and says nothing about the redness. That gap is not temporary, it is built into the type of description. You can make the physical description more detailed, more precise, more comprehensive, and the experience remains outside it. Not because science has not gone far enough, but because physical description is not the kind of description that captures it. That is not a trick question about imaginary creatures. It is a formal argument that the physical description of a person leaves something out. In the early 2000s, a neuroscientist named Giulio Tononi proposed something that sounded, on the surface, like a technical framework for measuring consciousness, a mathematical quantity called phi, representing how much information a system generates as a whole beyond the sum of its parts. That sounds dry. It is not. What Tononi was doing was attempting something that nobody in the field had seriously managed before. He was trying to give consciousness a number, not a metaphor, not a correlation, not a region on a brain scan, an actual quantity derived from the structure of a system that tells you how conscious that system is. The central claim of integrated information theory is this: consciousness is identical to integrated information, not correlated with it, not produced by it, identical to it. A system is conscious to exactly the degree that it generates more information as a unified whole than its individual parts could generate on their own. That gap, the difference between the whole and the sum of the parts, is phi. High phi means high consciousness. No phi means no experience at all. Here is why that is interesting and not just a technical curiosity. For the first time, you have a theory that makes real predictions. When you fall into dreamless sleep, phi should drop. When you go under general anesthesia, phi should drop. When you are alert and engaged, phi should be high. And when you run those tests, the predictions hold. The theory is not just philosophically coherent, it produces measurable outcomes. Researchers took this seriously enough to develop something called the Perturbational Complexity Index, a clinical tool that uses TMS and EEG to stimulate the brain and measure how complex and integrated its response is. You send a pulse into the cortex and watch how the signal propagates. In a conscious brain, it spreads in rich, differentiated patterns across many regions. In an unconscious brain, it either collapses quickly or repeats in simple, low-complexity waves. The Perturbational Complexity Index has been used in patients with disorders of consciousness. It gives clinicians a way to assess whether someone locked in a minimally responsive state might still have some degree of awareness that their behavior is not revealing. That is a real clinical application, derived from a theory that started as a mathematical abstraction. The theory works. Now here is the part that the field has been much quieter about. If consciousness is integrated information, and if any system with sufficient integration has consciousness to some degree, then consciousness does not belong exclusively to brains. It belongs to any system that integrates information in the right way. That includes simple animals. That includes certain networks. That could include computers, depending on architecture. And if you follow the logic all the way down, it includes systems far simpler than anything we would ordinarily call a mind. Small clusters of interacting elements, if they integrate information above zero, have some non-zero phi. Some faint, minimal degree of experience. This is not an accidental side effect of the theory. It is not a loose end Tononi failed to tie off. It follows directly and necessarily from the core claim. If consciousness equals integrated information, and integrated information exists in simple systems, then consciousness exists in simple systems. The logic does not stop at the boundary of the skull. What does that actually mean? It means IIT implies panpsychism. Not loosely, not metaphorically, structurally. The theory that has produced the most rigorous clinical tool in consciousness science, the theory that has held up against empirical tests, the theory developed by a neuroscientist working inside the mainstream tradition, that theory leads directly to the conclusion that consciousness is a fundamental feature of physical systems rather than a special product of biological brains. The field knows this. Critics have raised it explicitly. And the standard response is to acknowledge the implication, note the discomfort, and proceed. Christof Koch is worth paying attention to here. Koch is not a fringe figure. He spent decades as one of the most productive researchers in neuroscience, working alongside Francis Crick on the neural correlates of consciousness, running a major laboratory, publishing across every significant venue in the field. He was, for a long time, exactly the kind of scientist who pursued consciousness through the standard empirical framework. Find the correlates, map the mechanisms, close the gaps one experiment at a time. He co-developed IIT with Tononi. And over the past several years, his public position has shifted in a direction that is striking to watch. By 2026, Koch was presenting at major conferences on topics including near-death experiences, unexplained moments of heightened clarity immediately before death, and the possibility that consciousness is not a product of the brain at all, but a fundamental property of reality. He is not describing these as speculations he entertains privately. He is presenting them as serious scientific and philosophical positions that the evidence is pushing him toward. He is saying, directly, that the hard problem has not been solved and may not be solvable within the standard materialist framework. He is saying that IIT points somewhere the field has not been willing to follow. That is a significant thing to watch happen to a person with his credentials and his history. It is not a conversion or a breakdown. It is what happens when someone follows the evidence carefully for 30 years and ends up somewhere that the evidence actually points. The question is whether the field follows, or whether it treats Koch the way it treats every result that points toward an uncomfortable conclusion. The perturbational complexity index works. The clinical predictions hold. The phi framework is coherent and testable. And the theory that produced all of that says, by its own internal logic, that consciousness might be woven into the fabric of physical reality rather than generated by a particular arrangement of neurons in a particular kind of animal on a particular planet. The most prominent scientist who spent decades mapping the neural correlates of consciousness now argues publicly that consciousness might be a fundamental property of the universe, and the field has mostly responded with the same reaction it gives every uncomfortable conclusion: careful acknowledgement and silence. The idea that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of reality, not something brains produce but something the universe already has, used to be the kind of position that ended careers. That has changed. Not loudly, not with a press conference or a paradigm-shifting announcement. It changed the way uncomfortable shifts usually happen in academic philosophy, through careful papers, qualified arguments, and the slow accumulation of a literature that the mainstream cannot quite dismiss but also cannot quite absorb. Philip Goff, a philosopher at Durham University, has spent years writing peer-reviewed defenses of panpsychism, not as metaphor, not as spirituality dressed in academic language, as a serious, argued position about the fundamental nature of reality. His work sits in the same journals as the work that dismisses it. That is new. 10 years ago, it was not sitting there at all. So what is the actual claim? Panpsychism does not say the universe is dreaming. It does not say rocks have thoughts or that rivers feel sadness. The claim is narrower and stranger than that. It says that experience, the raw capacity for there to be something it is like to be a thing, is a fundamental property of reality, like mass, like charge, not produced by matter at sufficient complexity, present in matter as a basic feature of what matter is. What brains do, under this view, is not generate consciousness the way a fire generates heat. What brains do is concentrate and organize something that was already there. That is a different kind of claim entirely. The argument for it is not mystical. That is worth being clear about. The argument is grounded almost entirely in the failure of the alternative. Materialism, the view that consciousness is something physical processes produce, has had decades of serious effort behind it. The hard problem has been formally on the table since 1994. 30 years of some of the sharpest minds in philosophy and neuroscience working on it. And the gap has not closed, not narrowed meaningfully, not shown signs of closing. At some point, when a framework produces no progress on its central problem for 30 years, that is evidence about the framework. The panpsychist argument is essentially this. If physical processes cannot in principle explain why they are accompanied by experience, then maybe experience is not something physical processes produce, maybe it is something they have. That move sounds radical, but it is a direct logical response to a failure that everyone in the field acknowledges. Now consider cosmopsychism, which takes the basic panpsychist claim and runs it in a different direction. Cosmopsychism says that the universe's consciousness did not build up from smaller pieces. It was there first. Individual minds, human, animal, whatever else qualifies, are not the universe generating consciousness for the first time. They are local concentrations of something cosmic and prior. The universe's awareness came before ours. Our awareness is a regional feature of it. This sounds like mysticism. It reads, on first pass, like something you would find in a theology text rather than a philosophy journal. But the argument behind it is structural. If consciousness is fundamental, then there is a question about whether it aggregates from small pieces or derives from a larger whole. Cosmopsychism takes the second option. Individual minds are not additions. They are subtractions from something already total. Here is the objection that always arrives at this point. If panpsychism is true, then electrons are conscious. And that sounds absurd. That sounds like the kind of thing that should disqualify a position immediately, because electrons are not conscious. They are particles. They do not have experiences. They do not have anything. The panpsychist response to this is precise and worth following carefully. The claim is not that electrons have thoughts, not that electrons feel joy or process information or wonder about anything. The claim is that electrons have proto-experiential properties, properties that are not yet experience in any recognizable sense, but that are the kind of thing experience is made of. Call it the raw material rather than the finished structure. And here is the question that makes the objection harder than it looks. Why is that more absurd than saying electrons have mass? Electrons have mass. We do not know why. We do not have a deeper explanation for what mass is or why particles have it. We just observe that they do and build from there. Charge is the same, spin is the same. The fundamental properties of matter are not explained by anything beneath them. They are the bottom level. Panpsychism is asking whether proto-experience belongs on that list. That is not obviously more absurd than the list we already accept. What makes this genuinely unsettling, what keeps it from being a comfortable philosophical curiosity, is the position it puts the mainstream alternative in. The mainstream view is that consciousness is not fundamental. It emerges from matter that has none. At some point in the assembly of neurons and synapses and electrochemical gradients, experience appears. There is no moment you can point to, no threshold anyone has identified, no mechanism anyone has described that takes non-experiencing matter and produces an experiencing system. The mainstream view requires that transition to happen, cannot explain how it happens, and treats that inability as a temporary technical problem rather than a structural one. Panpsychism at least removes the mystery of emergence by denying it ever occurs. Whether that is a solution or a redefinition of the problem depends on which failure you find more tolerable. Christof Koch spent decades mapping neural correlates of consciousness. He is now publicly arguing that consciousness may be a fundamental feature of reality. That shift did not come from abandoning rigor, it came from following the data. And the mainstream alternative, that experience somehow erupts out of matter that has none, is not less strange. It just has the advantage of being familiar. In the 1960s, a neurosurgeon named Roger Sperry began cutting the connection between the two halves of the brain in epileptic patients, and what he found in the aftermath should have permanently changed how we think about what consciousness is. The surgery was called a corpus callosotomy. The corpus callosum is the thick bundle of nerve fibers connecting the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Roughly 200 million axons carrying information back and forth between the two sides at every moment of conscious life. Severing it stopped the seizures from spreading. It worked. They reported feeling completely normal. One unified person, one continuous experience, nothing missing. Then Sperry and his colleague Michael Gazzaniga ran the experiments, and the results were not normal at all. Here is what they found. If you show an image exclusively to the left visual field, which feeds into the right hemisphere, the patient cannot tell you what they saw. The right hemisphere has no direct access to the speech centers, which sit in the left hemisphere. The information is there, the right hemisphere received it, but the verbal system never got the signal. Ask the patient what they saw, and they say nothing. They genuinely report seeing nothing, but the left hand knows. The left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, can reach into a bag of objects and pull out the one that matches what was shown. Two separate processes, one brain, one person who insists they saw nothing. Now this is where things become genuinely unsettling. Ask the patient why their left hand just picked up that object. The left hemisphere, which genuinely had no access to what the right hemisphere saw, no information about what just happened, does not say, "I don't know." It does not hesitate. It produces an answer, immediately, confidently, and completely wrong. It confabulates. It invents a plausible story and delivers it with the full conviction of first-hand memory. That is not a minor quirk of experimental design. That is the narrating self, caught in the act of making things up about its own behavior. Sperry won the Nobel Prize in 1981 for this work. The finding is not disputed. It has been replicated across decades and across patients. What it reveals about the structure of consciousness is something the field has been reluctant to follow to its conclusion. If cutting a single cable between brain regions produces what appears to be two independent streams of conscious processing in the same skull, then consciousness is not what it feels like from the inside. It does not feel divided. It does not feel like two agents sharing a body. It feels like one seamless, unified experience. That feeling is apparently wrong. The unity of consciousness, the thing that seems most obvious and most certain about your own inner life, is a product of connectivity. Remove the connectivity and the unity fractures. Two hemispheres, each processing information, each directing behavior, each operating without full access to what the other is doing. What does that tell you about the nature of the self? My position is that it tells you something deeply uncomfortable. The unified conscious self you experience is not a fundamental fact about what you are. It is a construction. It depends on physical connections being intact. Sever those connections surgically, and you do not destroy the person. You reveal that the person was always more than one process running in parallel, stitched together into the appearance of unity. And then there is the confabulation. That piece matters as much as the split itself. The left hemisphere, when confronted with behavior it did not generate and cannot explain, does not acknowledge the gap. It fills the gap, instantly, without effort. The story it produces sounds like memory. It has the texture of genuine recollection. The patient does not experience themselves as making something up. They experience themselves as remembering why they did what they did, which raises a question worth sitting with. How much of what you believe about your own behavior is the same process? Not in a brain that has been surgically altered, in an ordinary, intact brain going about its ordinary day. The left hemisphere in a normal brain does not have complete access to everything the right hemisphere does either. It does not have direct access to most of the processing that drives your decisions, your reactions, your impulses. The speech system generates explanations. That is what it does. It narrates. The question the split brain research actually opens is not whether severed brains behave strangely. Of course they do. The question is whether the confabulating narrator is an exception created by the surgery, or whether it is the default condition of conscious self-report exposed by the surgery because the surgery made the gap visible. There is no clean natural experiment in an intact brain that lets you check. The narrator is always already running. It is the thing doing the checking. Gazzaniga, who continued this research for decades after Sperry, eventually argued that the left hemisphere operates as an interpreter, a module whose function is specifically to generate coherent explanatory narratives about behavior that other systems have already produced, not to guide the behavior, to explain it after the fact. If that model is correct, then the voice inside your head that tells you why you do what you do is not the author of your actions. It is the biographer. It shows up after the event, reviews whatever evidence is available, and writes a story that feels like it was always the truth. The verbal self does not know why it does what it does. It finds out after, constructs a story, and reports the story as memory. Here is the problem sitting underneath all of the brain scanning and the electrode recording and the increasingly sophisticated neuroimaging. It is not a technical problem, it is not a funding problem, it is a logical problem, and it has been sitting there since the beginning, mostly unaddressed. We measure consciousness using neural correlates. That is the standard method. You put someone in a scanner, you present them with a stimulus, you record which regions activate, which circuits engage, which patterns change. Then you compare conscious states to unconscious ones, and you identify what differs. That difference is your correlate. The Perturbational Complexity Index works on this principle. It uses TMS to stimulate the brain and EEG to record the response, and it quantifies how complex and integrated that response is. Higher complexity, more consciousness. Lower complexity, less. The measure comes directly out of integrated information theory, and it has genuine clinical value. Doctors use it to assess patients in vegetative states. It has told us things we did not know before. None of that is in dispute. Here is the question nobody asks out loud. How do we know it is actually measuring consciousness and not just measuring a particular kind of neural complexity? Those are not the same thing. The whole point of the hard problem is that the relationship between physical processes and subjective experience is not obvious, not derivable, not something you can read off the brain scan. So when we build a measure of neural complexity and call it a proxy for consciousness, we are assuming the thing we are trying to prove. We are defining consciousness as the kind of thing this measure captures, and then concluding that this measure captures consciousness. That is a circle, a complete, closed, unbroken circle, and there is no exit from it. Every instrument we use to study consciousness is operated by a conscious observer. Every experiment is designed by a conscious mind, interpreted by a conscious mind, reported through conscious language. We cannot step outside consciousness to check whether our measurements align with the real thing. We are inside the system we are trying to measure. That is not a limitation of current technology. Better fMRI resolution does not solve it. More electrodes do not solve it. It is a structural feature of the problem itself. Now extend this outward. If we cannot verify our measurements even for the human brains we understand best, what do we do with every other system? Animals, infants, patients with severe brain injuries, patients in minimally conscious states, potentially, at some point, artificial systems. We have no test that definitively establishes whether any of these systems is conscious, not because we lack the instruments, because we have no agreed definition of what we are looking for in the first place. The question of whether a dog is conscious, whether a newborn infant is conscious, whether a patient whose eyes are open and whose brain shows some activity is conscious. These are not empirical questions waiting on better data. They are conceptual questions that our current framework cannot answer. We do not know what consciousness requires. We do not know its necessary conditions. So we cannot design a test for its presence or absence in any system whose report we cannot directly verify. This matters in ways that go beyond philosophy. Right now, there are patients lying in hospital beds whose families are asking whether anyone is still there. Clinicians are using tools like the Perturbational Complexity Index to make assessments, and those tools are the best we have, and they are genuinely useful, but they are not measuring consciousness directly. They are measuring neural complexity and inferring. The inference rests on assumptions that have not been validated, because validation would require solving the very problem those tools were designed to probe. What makes this worse is the state of the theories. Integrated information theory and global workspace theory are the two most developed frameworks in the field. Both have serious researchers behind them. Both have generated real predictions and real experiments, and they are not minor variations on the same idea. They make fundamentally incompatible predictions about which systems are conscious. Global workspace theory ties consciousness to the broadcast of information across a distributed cortical network. IIT ties it to integrated information, which can in principle be high in systems with no cortex at all. Applied to the same patient, a patient with severe cortical damage but preserved subcortical integration, the two theories point in opposite directions. One says there is likely some awareness remaining. The other says the conditions for consciousness are not met. Both cannot be right. The field has not resolved this. It has noted the incompatibility, published papers about it, and continued funding both research programs simultaneously. That is where the measurement problem actually lives, not in the instruments, in the fact that we are trying to measure something we do not have a coherent theory of, using tools that were built on theories that contradict each other, and then using the results to make clinical decisions about human beings. Two of the leading theories of consciousness, applied to the same patient, give different answers about whether anyone is home. When physicists start showing up in neuroscience, something has gone wrong, or something has gone right, depending on which part of the problem you are looking at. The theory that brought them in is called Orchestrated Objective Reduction, Orch OR for short. It was proposed in the 1990s by Roger Penrose, a mathematical physicist, and Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist. The collaboration itself is telling. A physicist and the doctor who removes consciousness for a living, working together on what consciousness actually is. Their claim was specific. Consciousness involves quantum computations occurring inside microtubules, tiny protein structures found within neurons. These computations are not random. They are proposed to be orchestrated by biological processes and terminated by a mechanism Penrose linked to quantum gravity, a threshold at which quantum superpositions collapse in a way that is neither purely deterministic nor random. That collapse, they argued, is where experience enters the picture, not as a byproduct of neural firing, as something happening at the boundary between quantum and classical physics. The field's initial response was dismissal, loud, confident, largely unanimous dismissal. The brain is warm, it is wet, it is chemically chaotic at the scale of individual molecules. Quantum coherence, the fragile condition required for quantum computation to occur, collapses in biological systems in femtoseconds, that is quadrillionths of a second. Neural processes operate at millisecond timescales. The gap between those numbers is so vast that quantum computation at the scale relevant to conscious thought seemed, to most physicists and neuroscientists, not just unproven, but physically incoherent. The thermal noise alone should destroy any quantum state before it could do anything meaningful. This is the standard objection. It is serious. It deserves to be taken seriously. Here is what happened to it. In 2007, researchers studying photosynthesis found quantum coherence operating in biological systems at room temperature. Plants, absorbing sunlight and transferring energy with an efficiency that classical physics could not fully account for, and doing it through quantum coherence at warm, wet, biologically noisy temperatures. The coherence lasted long enough to matter. That finding did not prove Orch OR. It proved that the dismissal was premature. If evolution produced quantum coherence in photosynthesis because it was useful, the question of whether it did the same thing elsewhere in biology is no longer obviously absurd. Evolution has no commitment to staying inside the boundaries that physicists find convenient. Then, December 2025. New research published on macroscopic quantum effects in the brain, specifically proposing that neural systems may interact with zero-point fields, the baseline energy state of quantum field theory, in ways that produce measurable effects on conscious processing. This is not Orch OR directly, but it is the same class of claim that quantum mechanics is doing something in the brain that classical neuroscience is not equipped to describe. Separately, experimental work using anesthesia began targeting the question specifically. If quantum processes in microtubules contribute to consciousness, anesthetic agents should disrupt those processes in predictable ways. Hameroff had proposed this connection for years. The experimental probes are now being designed around it. That is a shift. A theory gets dismissed for 2 decades, and then researchers start building experiments to test its specific predictions. That does not happen unless something in the existing framework has begun to visibly fail. My position is this. Whether Orch OR is correct is not the most important question here. It may not be correct. The microtubule hypothesis may turn out to be wrong in its specifics. What matters is what the hypothesis represents, which is physicists deciding that the classical computational picture of the brain, neurons firing, signals integrating, information processing, is not a sufficient account of what consciousness is. Penrose did not arrive at Orch OR because he was attracted to mysticism. He arrived at it through a formal argument about the limits of computation itself, rooted in Gödel's incompleteness theorems, concluding that human mathematical understanding involves something that no classical computational system can replicate. He needed a non-classical mechanism. Quantum gravity was the only candidate he found credible. That is a physicist following the logic to wherever it leads, which is how you are supposed to do science. The deeper problem is this. Neuroscience has spent decades producing increasingly detailed maps of neural correlates. Quantum mechanics has spent decades producing increasingly precise descriptions of physical reality at small scales. Neither framework, on its own, has produced an explanation of why any physical system is accompanied by experience. When two mature scientific frameworks both fail to account for the same phenomenon, the next step is usually that a third framework gets pulled in to bridge them. That is what is happening here. Quantum mechanics is appearing in consciousness papers not because physicists had nothing better to do. It is appearing because the classical neuroscience account ran out of explanatory power and the physicists noticed the gap. Something biological is producing subjective experience. Classical neuroscience maps where it happens. It cannot explain why. Quantum mechanics may not explain it either. But the fact that the question is pulling in physics at all tells you exactly where the standard story breaks down. That the physics keeps getting pulled in is not a sign that quantum consciousness is correct. It is a sign that the classical explanation is not working. Here is what 30 years of serious consciousness research has quietly produced without ever quite saying it out loud. Every major finding points in the same direction, and the field keeps stepping to the edge of that direction and then stepping back. Look at the pattern. Integrated information theory gets developed by serious researchers, earns clinical application, and then produces an implication that nobody in the mainstream wants to follow. That consciousness is not something brains manufacture, but something the universe already has. The field cites IIT thousands of times. The panpsychism implication gets a careful footnote, and the research programs move on. The hard problem is 30 years old as a formal question. It has not been solved. It has not been narrowed. In several respects, the brain scanning and the electrode work and the increasingly precise neuroimaging have made it harder, not easier, to explain away. Every new correlate we identify raises the same question the last one did. Why does this process produce experience rather than nothing? The field publishes the correlates. The question stays open. Nobody officially declares that something structural is wrong with the framework. Quantum mechanics starts appearing in consciousness papers. Physicists get pulled in. Research emerges in late 2025 suggesting the brain may interact with zero-point fields in ways consistent with macroscopic quantum effects. This is not a fringe publication. It is peer-reviewed work pointing at the possibility that classical neuroscience is using the wrong physics to study the right problem. The field acknowledges it, cites it, and continues running fMRI studies inside the same classical framework. Then there is Christof Koch. He spent decades as one of the most prominent researchers in the field. He built much of the modern science around neural correlates of consciousness alongside Francis Crick. He is not a philosopher with a speculative position. He is a working neuroscientist with decades of empirical work behind him. And in April 2026, he presented at a major symposium confronting the hard problem directly, arguing that consciousness may be a fundamental property of reality, not a product of the brain. He discussed near-death experiences and unexplained moments of clarity immediately before death as phenomena that the current framework has no account for. This is not a scientist going rogue. This is a scientist following the evidence to where it actually leads. The field noted it and continued. Now here is my position on that. This is not how science normally behaves when a genuine signal appears. When a real finding challenges the dominant framework, the normal response is engagement. Other researchers test it, challenge it, try to break it. That process is how fields move forward. The absence of that process is not neutral. It is a signal about what the field has collectively decided not to pursue. Why the managed distance? The same reason it shows up everywhere else when a formally published conclusion points somewhere uncomfortable. The professional cost is asymmetric. A researcher who builds a serious career on panpsychism and turns out to be wrong faces permanent credibility damage. A researcher who stays inside the neural correlates framework, publishes competent work, and never follows the implication toward its destination pays no professional price at all. The incentive structure of science does not reward the scientist who follows the conclusion. It rewards the scientist who produces publishable findings within an accepted framework. These are not the same thing. The result is a field that has been edging toward a conclusion for 3 decades without stating it. The conclusion is not that panpsychism is correct. It is not that quantum consciousness is established. The conclusion is narrower and more uncomfortable than either of those. It is that the current materialist framework, the assumption that consciousness is something physical brains produce through mechanisms science can in principle fully describe, has not survived 30 years of serious engagement with the hard problem. Every tool we have built to study consciousness describes the machinery. Nothing we have built explains why the machinery produces experience. That gap has not closed. It has not shrunk. And the theories that have tried hardest to close it have done so by moving the starting assumption, not by bridging the gap from the old one. That is worth sitting with. Because what it means is that the honest position, the position the evidence actually supports, is that we do not know what consciousness is. We do not know where it comes from. We do not know whether it is something brains generate or something brains participate in. Those are 3 different problems, and we have not solved any of them. The field publishes within the framework anyway. Researchers map correlates, refine scanning techniques, develop clinical indices. Useful work, competent work, work that does not touch the central question. We are the species that builds instruments sensitive enough to detect gravitational waves from colliding black holes a billion light years away. We cannot explain the thing you are using right now to understand that sentence. And the institutions best positioned to pursue that question have spent 30 years carefully working around it instead of through it. The field keeps finding evidence that the standard framework is wrong and keeps declining to say so directly, which is not science being careful. That is science being comfortable.